welcome to the Craft House Magic Setter tutorials. My name's Ellie and I'm going to chat to you about some tips on how to start colourwork knitting. So I haven't been colourwork knitting for very long, but I feel as if there's a few things I'd like to share with you to encourage you to get started. So this looks like a really complicated pattern, so it's probably not the best one to start with. But actually, on each row you're only ever working with 2 yarns, so I can just show you how I do my colour work. So in order to hold my yarn, I hold 1 yarn in each of my hands. But you don't have to do this. If you start off just knitting with one hand, or whichever your hand you normally knit with, dropping that one and picking up your second yarn. But I think a good tip is to try and have your 2 colours that you're working with on separate sides so that they don't get tangled. So I run the yarn around this finger and then over the top of my index finger, and do exactly the same with the other one if you want to hold it in the same way as I do. And I find that this is nice and easy because I don't have to pick up and drop any yarns, but don't feel that you have to do it this way. Whatever's comfortable for you, it doesn't matter. So in order to knit, I've just noticed I've done 2 stitches wrong, so I'll go backwards a bit. So I'm going to knit a red colour here, and then I'm going to go back to the blue and then red. So normally I would knit with my hands underneath the work, but I think you can see what I'm doing better if I hold my work like this. So there we go. I'll continue knitting with alternate colours, following the charts like so. So you might hear of things like yarn dominance in things like ferrule work, because there's one of the yarns is actually knitted slightly looser so that you can see more of it on the front of the work. So you might notice that when you're doing little test swatches that your one hand is slightly looser than the other, so then you'd make sure that you put the yarn that you want to stick out most in your project on that side. So I know that with my left hand I am very slightly looser than my right hand, for instance. So in some schools of thought, I think places like Norway, think that you should have the same tension on both hands. But I think it's really up to you. As long as you're aware of how your tension is behaving and how you're controlling that tension, it really doesn't matter which way you decide to do it. So for instance, with a pattern like this, there's no real sort of dominant colour as such, so I'm trying to keep my tension as equal as possible. So I'm using Jamieson and Smith yarn here, which is 100% Shetland yarn, which is a non-superwash. And you might have heard that people tend to use yarns like this for colour work, and the reason is that when it's actually knitted up, it's actually easier to get a neater finish because the yarns sort of mesh into each other a little bit. If you use a superwash yarn, it doesn't have this effect and it doesn't always come out as neat. So you can do colour work in whatever yarn you like, it just is easier to get a neater job when you use yarns that are non-superwash like this 100% Shetland yarn. This is a Jamieson and Smith. So it's up to you exactly what yarns you use and what school of thought you decide to use for the yarn dominance, but really don't worry about it. Do what you enjoy and what you feel is easiest for you. So I think that so far when I've been knitting colour work, I've found that it's easier to knit hats, for instance, on a loop like this rather than doing it on magic loop, because it's harder to keep your tension equal when you've got your loop of cable coming out the other end, where you're actually crossing over to the other side. When you're doing magic loop, there can be a very tight tension around this edge. So having a circular needle like this and not using magic loop makes it a lot easier. Also, when you're doing colour work, you need to think about catching your floats on the back of the work. So as you can see, as you're changing colours, you have these threads that sort of float on the back. Now I tend to knit up to 5 stitches before I'll catch a float, but I'll show you how I catch a float. I'll just pick up my yarns. Here we go. So I'm going to go against the pattern, so don't worry. So if I'm doing about I don't know, 7 or 8 stitches. I'll knit a few in that colour, and then if I want to catch the float, put my needle through the stitch and then behind the one you want to catch, and then you wrap your yarn around the needle and then through both the yarn you want to catch and the stitch, so it catches that yarn at the back of the work without showing it on the front of the work. And if I just do a few more stitches, you will be able to see that that is caught. There we go. So some people actually knit their ends into their work using this catching method as well. So say if I had an end that I'd finished knitting with on this side, I'll just use this as an example. I would catch my yarn on every other stitch so that it's effectively weaving it into the work. So if you look at the back, you can see that's woven in. So that saves you sewing your ends in. However, I do find that if you leave your ends in and sew them in later, you can possibly get a neater finish. Although I think with a bit more practice at sewing the ends in this method, it would probably work better. But just so you know, you can try it, see what you like best, and just choose what method suits you. So what I'd suggest is to pick a smallish project like a hat or a pair of mittens, and perhaps pick a project where you've only got 2 colours in the whole project just to get you into it. And then actually things like this, where you've only actually got 2 different yarns on each row, actually when you get into it and break it down into small sections, it's really not as hard as you think. So have a go at some colour work, don't be frightened. It doesn't matter if your tension's not right, it just takes a little bit of practice to get into it. Really important to sort of make little swatches, or to be honest, if you're knitting like a small fingerless mitten, you could just try knitting a small portion of it, test to see whether your gauge fits, try it on, see if it fits, and then carry on knitting if it fits. If it doesn't, work out what gauge adjustments you need to make. So have a go at colourwork knitting. I hope to see you watching the next podcast, and happy knitting. Bye!